The trouble began on a quiet Thursday morning in a neighborhood where trouble rarely had the courage to announce itself. The Oak Ridge Reserve community prided itself on picture-perfect lawns, excessively enthusiastic garden committees, and an HOA president who treated the rules like sacred scripture. Her name was Linda Pennington, a woman whose entire sense of purpose seemed to revolve around watching for violations that no one else cared about and crafting policies no one had asked for. With her binoculars permanently stationed by her bay window and a clipboard never more than a few feet away, she monitored the cul-de-sac with an intensity normally reserved for national security surveillance. For months, Linda had been quietly irritated by the arrival of a new homeowner, a reserved, soft-spoken black woman named Jordan Hale. Jordan had purchased the old Hawthorne property at the end of the street, a once neglected home she quickly transformed with fresh paint, modern fixtures, and landscaping that actually made the block look better. But improvements were irrelevant to Linda. What mattered to her was that the new resident didn't attend HOA meetings, didn't respond to the passive-aggressive newsletters, and didn't bow to the unwritten hierarchy that placed Linda at the top. The problem escalated when Jordan installed new security cameras. While perfectly legal and unobtrusive, the mere presence of them stirred a paranoia that Linda had long suppressed. She convinced herself that the cameras were pointed directly at her house, capturing her every movement, documenting her authority in a way she found suspicious and deeply offensive. She paced her living room, muttering to herself about privacy violations, community standards, and external threats. Each step fueled her imagination until she was certain something had to be done. The breaking point arrived when Jordan parked her police-issued SUV on her driveway. The vehicle was unmarked, subtle, and standard for her line of work, but Linda had no idea what kind of work that was. She saw the dark tinted windows, the quiet engine, and the tactical case Jordan carried inside. From her living room, her imagination flared again. She convinced herself that the SUV belonged to someone dangerous, someone involved in criminal activity. And because Jordan didn't socialize, didn't gossip, and didn't feed into neighborhood chatter, Linda interpreted that silence as secrecy. By noon, she had built an entire conspiracy theory in her mind. She decided Jordan was a threat to the neighborhood. She believed the community needed protecting, and as HOA president, she appointed herself the person to do it. All she needed was a moment, a single excuse to take action. That moment came on a breezy afternoon when Jordan left her garbage bins by the curb for longer than Linda deemed acceptable. The bins were neatly arranged, not blocking the road or sidewalk, but for Linda, it was symbolic. A violation on the surface level, but beneath it, a sign, a confirmation of the narrative she had been constructing. She interpreted it as disrespect, defiance, and a direct challenge to her authority. She marched toward her house, adrenaline building, and snatched up the phone. What came next was a mix of panic, performance, and malice. She fabricated a scenario of forced entry, insisting a suspicious woman had broken into the Hawthorne property and was armed. She described the homeowner as being away. She claimed she saw the woman forcing the door open. She spoke with exaggerated urgency, injecting fear and distress into every word. It was a lie so large that even she seemed to believe it. Moments later, emergency services mobilized. Dispatchers prioritized the call, unaware that the fabricated report was designed to weaponize fear against an innocent resident. Neighbors observed lights, sirens, and tactical gear moving swiftly through the street. Linda watched from her window, feeding off the spectacle she had created. She believed she had finally taken control of a situation that had spiraled too far from her liking. She imagined the validation she would receive when authorities confirmed her suspicions. In her mind, she was the hero of the neighborhood. Meanwhile, inside her home, Jordan was reviewing body cam footage from her last shift. As a detective with the city police department, she spent her day off organizing evidence, updating reports, and preparing testimony for an upcoming case. Her home was peaceful, her routine quiet, and she had no idea that outside, a narrative of fiction was unfolding faster than she could possibly interrupt. The officers approaching her door had no reason to doubt the call they received. They had been told a dangerous intruder was inside, possibly armed. They moved with caution, following protocol, ready for the unknown. As they reached the porch, they noticed the surveillance cameras capturing every angle. Their radios crackled, and one officer gave a discreet signal. The situation was escalating, fueled not by fact, but by the imagination of a neighborhood overseer who believed her suspicions outweighed the truth. Inside, Jordan heard the commotion, the footsteps, the subtle metallic clatter of tactical gear, the radio murmurs. Her instincts sharpened instantly. Years of training taught her the difference between routine noise and tactical movement. She straightened, positioned herself near the entryway, and prepared to make her presence known without escalating the situation. She remained calm, alert, and measured. Outside, the officers prepared to breach. Linda, still watching from her living room, felt a surge of triumph. She believed her lie was becoming the reality she desired. But reality has limits, and it snapped into place the moment Jordan stepped into view and identified herself as police. The team paused. Confusion rippled through the group. Radios chimed. Orders shifted. The breach halted. In an instant, the narrative cracked. Officers exchanged brief glances as the truth surfaced. The homeowner wasn't an intruder. She wasn't armed. She wasn't a threat. She was law enforcement, one of their own. And someone had used 911 to manipulate them into an armed confrontation. Inside her home, Jordan listened carefully as the officers explained the report they'd received. Her face remained composed, but internally, something colder took shape. She understood instantly what had happened. She knew the type of person who would make such a call. She recognized the malice hiding underneath the fabricated concern, and she intended to pursue it. Outside, the officers began clearing the scene, exchanging muted remarks as confusion gave way to frustration. They recorded the false report, escalating it through the proper channels. False emergency calls were criminal offenses, dangerous ones, especially when they involved law enforcement. From her window, Linda watched with growing unease. She expected officers to drag someone out of the house. She expected chaos that validated her paranoia. Instead, she saw officials packing up, exchanging looks that told a different story. Her confidence began to falter. She tried to rationalize what she was seeing, but the truth hovered in her mind like an unwelcome shadow. Something had gone wrong, terribly wrong. Jordan stepped outside shortly after, speaking calmly with the officers. Her posture was composed, but her expression contained a quiet storm. She noticed Linda watching. Their eyes met briefly across the distance, and Linda recoiled slightly, realizing she had just targeted the last person she should ever antagonize. And as the officers departed, as neighbors peeked through blinds and whispered among themselves, and as the sun dipped lower and shadows stretched long across driveways, a new tension settled over Oak Ridge Reserve. One built not on gossip or speculation, but on the knowledge that someone had lied to weaponize authority, and the person targeted was the very authority they tried to abuse. It was a tension that would only grow from here.
The quiet of Oak Ridge Reserve never returned after the false 911 call. It lingered in every trimmed lawn, every cul-de-sac whisper, every nervous glance exchanged between neighbors who suddenly realized the block wasn't as peaceful as they pretended it was. Word spread with the speed and precision only suburban gossip could achieve. By the next morning, everyone knew that the woman who lived in the Hawthorne house was a police detective, and everyone also knew someone had lied to emergency dispatch about her. No one said Linda's name out loud. They didn't have to. The neighborhood had long learned the pattern of her behavior. The endless complaints, the fabricated HOA violations, the self-appointed vigilance. She had spent years treating paranoia as duty and meddling as public service. To most residents, her downfall felt less like a shock and more like something inevitable finally tightening around her. Jordan, however, approached the situation differently. Her training didn't allow for assumptions, gossip, or premature conclusions. She treated the incident like any other false emergency call, methodical, impartial, documented. She began with the basics, reviewing the recorded 911 call, assessing the timeline, and verifying the responding officer's statements. The details were unmistakable. The fabricated report was detailed, personal, and delivered with confidence. This wasn't a misunderstanding, it was intentional deception. The call described a dangerous intruder, matching her physical appearance. It referenced her home with precision. It detailed a scenario that could only have been observed from someone who knew the neighborhood well and who had been watching her. The weight of that realization settled in her chest like a stone. She replayed the recording twice, then a third time. Each repetition only confirmed what she already knew. This wasn't just a malicious lie, it was a targeted act of harassment, one that had escalated from whispers and silent judgment into a weaponized emergency call that could have ended with guns drawn. The potential consequences were not lost on Jordan. She had seen cases where false claims resulted in tragedy. She had investigated reports where innocent people were harmed because of fabricated emergencies. This time, the target had been her, and the gravity of that fact resonated deeply. She stepped outside later that morning for air. The neighborhood was unusually lively for a weekday. Curtains shifted as she passed, lawn sprinklers hummed in synchronized intervals. A few residents lingered in driveways, pretending to check mail or water plants while stealing nervous glances in her direction. She offered a polite nod to those who met her eyes, though most quickly looked away. Fear, guilt, or embarrassment, she couldn't tell which. At the end of the street, behind a blooming hedge of pink azaleas, she spotted the silhouette of Linda Pennington. The HOA president was perched near her bay window, peeking through blinds just enough to watch Jordan's every movement. The tension from the previous day still simmered, and though Linda's expression was partially hidden, it wasn't difficult to sense her fear. Fear, Jordan noted, was often the first crack in a liar's armor. The next step was procedural. She documented everything. Photos of her door, timestamps from her cameras, copies of the dispatcher's logs, written accounts from She contacted Internal Affairs to disclose her involvement in the case, ensuring she followed every ethical guideline. And then came the part she knew would shift the entire neighborhood's atmosphere, interviewing residents who may have witnessed what happened before the officers arrived. She began with the Bramwells across the street, a quiet middle-aged couple who had watched the flashing lights the day prior with stunned expressions. They recounted seeing Linda pacing frantically before emergency services arrived. They mentioned the binoculars, the phone clutched in her hand, and the way she had marched between her window and front porch with anxious fervor. She kept her notes factual, but internally a picture was already forming. She moved house to house, gathering information. Each resident contributed small details, seeing Linda outside earlier than usual, hearing her muttering to herself, watching her gesture angrily toward the Hawthorne property. One teenager commented that her SUV had been in the driveway longer than usual that morning, proving Jordan had indeed been home at the time of the alleged break-in. Piece by piece, the story revealed itself, and each piece pointed straight to the same person. Meanwhile, inside her home, Linda spiraled. Her narrative of heroism had crumbled the moment officers recognized Jordan as police. She spent the rest of the night pacing, deleting emails, reviewing HOA documents as if they held answers, and convincing herself she hadn't done anything seriously wrong. By morning, denial had wrapped itself around her like armor. But even denial couldn't shield her from what the HOA board discovered. One of the vice presidents, normally meek and intimidated by Linda, had overheard the chaos and requested a review of HOA bylaws. To his amazement, he discovered that weaponizing emergency services against a neighbor fell under community endangerment, which was grounds for removal from the HOA board and potential civil penalties. That detail wasn't public yet, but it loomed over the association like a gathering storm cloud. By noon, Jordan returned home feeling more certain than ever. The evidence was overwhelming. The call had originated from a blocked number, but she recognized the cadence of the voice. Anyone who had interacted with Linda long enough knew the precise, clipped tone she used when panicking. It was unmistakable. She uploaded her findings into her official case file, then prepared to complete the one step she had hoped to avoid, formally requesting the phone records tied to the 911 call. That request, once submitted, would confirm everything. It would expose the lie in full, and it would trigger criminal charges. As Jordan sat at her desk drafting the request, a subtle movement outside caught her attention. She looked through her front window and saw Linda walking briskly down the sidewalk, her face pale and drawn, her steps sharp with agitation. She clutched her clipboard like a lifeline, her eyes darting from house to house as if searching for evidence that the neighborhood was still under her control. But the neighborhood had changed. Whispers of the false report had stripped her of the fearful respect she once commanded. Residents stepped away when she approached. Some closed doors before she could reach them. Others walked inside without acknowledging her. It was subtle but powerful, an unspoken shift of loyalty. For the first time in years, Linda wasn't being listened to. She was being avoided. The balance of power in Oak Ridge Reserve had shifted, and as the sun dipped and shadows stretched across roofs and lawns,
The days that followed felt heavy, as though the neighborhood itself sensed an approaching reckoning. What began as a ripple of gossip had evolved into a quiet tremor, shaking the foundation of Oak Ridge Reserve in ways no one had expected. Most residents pretended to go about their daily routines, but the rhythm of the neighborhood had changed. People walked a little faster, watched a little closer, avoided conversations that might pull them into the widening conflict. Even the silence had become charged, thick with speculation and unease. Jordan, meanwhile, continued her investigation with the same calm precision she brought to every case. She had filed the official request for phone records, knowing it was only a matter of time before the truth became irrefutable. But until those records arrived, she needed to prepare for the next phase, confronting the broader consequences of the false report. Her home, once a space of peaceful retreat, now served as a temporary command center. She reviewed footage from her security cameras, annotated timestamps, cross-referenced statements from neighbors, and meticulously organized the evidence into a structured chronology. Every document, every detail, every observation strengthened the case she would soon present to prosecutors. She treated the situation without emotion, methodical, steady, professional. But beneath that professionalism simmered something colder. Not anger exactly, something sharper, something earned. Linda's actions had crossed a line many times worse than a petty HOA violation. She had weaponized emergency services to target an innocent homeowner. She had instigated a potentially deadly confrontation. She had used the system as a weapon and aimed it at the wrong person. Meanwhile, Linda moved through the neighborhood in a cloud of frantic energy. Her usual sense of authority had fractured into paranoia. She studied front porches for signs of residents discussing her. She tried to initiate conversations, but people consistently backed away, answering curtly before making excuses to leave. Even those who once admired her strict adherence to rules seemed suddenly hesitant to be seen beside her. The facade she'd built for years, HOA president, community guardian, neighborhood overseer, was collapsing. And her reactions only accelerated the fall. She paced her living room for hours at a time, replaying the events in her mind. She told herself she had only acted out of concern. She convinced herself she hadn't intended to cause harm. But even those justifications rang hollow as soon as she said them aloud. The fear of being exposed clung to her like humidity. The dread of consequences she never imagined now pressed heavily into her thoughts. The HOA board didn't help. Although they pretended nothing was wrong, there was a new stiffness in their interactions. The vice president had whispered concerns to two other board members, both of whom exchanged nervous looks and recommended a formal discussion at the next meeting. That phrase, formal discussion, was dangerous. It signaled that the board was preparing to distance themselves from her. Linda sensed it. She saw the shift in posture. She felt the hesitation in their voices, and the fear that grew in her chest made her desperate for control. She decided she needed to gather information, proof, something she could use to rewrite the narrative before anyone could challenge her version of events. She convinced herself that the security cameras on the Hawthorne property were recording something incriminating, something she needed to see. She walked past Jordan's house multiple times, pretending to inspect lawns and assess property boundaries. Each time, her eyes flicked toward the cameras, studying their angles, looking for blind spots.
But those cameras weren't like the cheap ones residents used for package theft. They were high quality, wide angle, motion sensitive, and sharp enough to catch every detail. Her presence didn't go unnoticed. Several neighbors saw her pacing the street with forced casualness. Some whispered about her circling the same block twice. Others took photos discreetly, sending them to friends with comments about how tense Linda appeared. Even Jordan noticed. Her living room camera notified her each time motion triggered near the driveway, and twice the alerts were Linda walking past slowly, her gaze locked on the house. Jordan didn't respond. She simply saved the footage. The pattern was becoming increasingly clear. Later that afternoon, Jordan received a notification from the precinct that the phone records tied to the emergency call were ready for pickup. The moment she read the message, the atmosphere in her home shifted. The case had crossed a threshold. The speculation and circumstantial evidence had solidified into confirmation. She changed into professional attire, grabbed her case folder, and prepared to drive to the station. Before she left, she reviewed one last piece of footage. Linda, standing at the end of her driveway, clenching her clipboard, staring toward the Hawthorne house with a mixture of fear and disbelief. It wasn't the look of someone wrongly accused. It was the look of someone expecting their world to collapse. Across the neighborhood, Linda found herself sinking deeper into panic. She spent the afternoon calling every HOA board member, trying to frame the situation as a misunderstanding. But each conversation was met with caution. After years of tolerating her overbearing presence, the HOA board seemed to sense an opportunity to remove her. The calls grew shorter, polite but firm. She received promises of a discussion later, but no one offered support. No one comforted her. And that silence frightened her more than anything else. By evening, as the sun cast long shadows across neatly trimmed lawns, Jordan returned home. She parked her SUV calmly, stepped out with confidence, and carried the sealed envelope containing the phone logs into her house. The moment she broke the seal and saw the originating number, the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The number matched Linda Pennington's home phone number. Not a blocked number, not an anonymous tip, not an accident. A deliberate call from the HOA president's own landline. Jordan's expression remained composed, but the air around her felt electric. There was no room left for hesitation. She had documented the truth. She had verified every detail. And now, with proof in hand, she could move forward. Outside, as dusk settled, Linda stood on her porch staring toward the Hawthorne property. She could feel the shift, subtle, cold, and irreversible. The weight of her own actions pressed against her chest. Somewhere deep inside, she knew what was coming. And Jordan was ready for the next step.
Night fell over Oak Ridge Reserve with an uneasy stillness, the kind that settles into the corners of a place where something irreversible is unfolding. Porch lights flickered on one by one, illuminating trimmed hedges and quiet sidewalks, but no amount of warm lighting could disguise the tension that had wrapped itself around the neighborhood. The residents felt it, the HOA board felt it, and most of all, Linda felt it like a tightening grip around her lungs. She spent the night pacing between windows, gripping her clipboard so tightly the wood creaked beneath her fingers. The street looked so normal, so deceptively calm, but she couldn't shake the dread that pressed against her ribs. Each passing car made her jump. Each shadow on the pavement made her heart stutter. In the past, she had reveled in the role of self-appointed overseer. Now it felt like the spotlights she once held over others had all turned onto her. Across the street, Jordan slept well for the first time since the incident. She had placed the phone records in a secured file box, organized the evidence, and prepared the documentation she would submit in the morning. Her conscience was clear. She wasn't seeking revenge or petty vindication. She wanted accountability. She wanted the truth to be recognized and the dangerous lie addressed with the seriousness it deserved. Her training had taught her a simple truth. When someone weaponizes law enforcement, the consequences can be severe, not only for the victim, but for entire communities. She had responded to calls where false reports spiraled into tragedy. This time, she refused to be another example. By sunrise, the neighborhood began stirring. Early risers stepped out to collect newspapers. Dogs were walked along familiar routes. But something was different today. People whispered in groups shorter than usual, their eyes flicking toward the Pennington home with a mix of pity and overdue disappointment. Rumors spread quickly. Someone had seen a police vehicle at Jordan's house late in the evening. Someone else claimed they heard the HOA board was meeting early. Theories circulated like pollen on the wind, and through it all, the residents knew one thing for certain. Something involving the HOA president was about to break wide open. Jordan left her home shortly after sunrise, dressed with purpose and carrying a neatly organized binder. She got into her SUV and drove calmly toward the precinct. Several neighbors witnessed her departure, exchanging knowing looks. They could guess where she was going, and most of them silently hoped she succeeded. Meanwhile, the HOA board gathered earlier than planned. The emergency meeting wasn't officially announced, but word of it traveled fast. Board members filed into the clubhouse with stiff expressions, clutching printed bylaw packets and notes they had hurriedly assembled the night before. The vice president appeared especially tense, avoiding eye contact with Linda when she arrived demanding answers. Linda stormed into the room with an air of defensive authority, insisting on explaining her actions before the board jumped to conclusions. She spoke rapidly, her explanations tangled with half-truths and contrived justifications. She painted herself as the concerned neighbor, the vigilant protector, the understood leader trying to guard the community from imagined threats. But the board members weren't nodding along in agreement as they usually did. Instead, they exchanged glances filled with discomfort. The weight of her lies already hung heavily in the room. Her rambling explanations only made things worse. One board member slid a printed copy of the HOA bylaws across the table. Another placed a printed transcript of the 911 call beside it. A third mentioned with forced politeness that several neighbors witnessed her acting strangely before emergency services arrived. The truth had seeped through every crack. Linda's face blanched. Her eyes darted across the documents as though the words themselves betrayed her. Her voice broke as she attempted to defend herself, shifting blame, insisting she believed there was a threat. But the room's energy had changed. The authority she once wielded with ease was gone. In its place stood the unmistakable reality that she had stepped far outside the boundaries of leadership and the law. As the board deliberated, Jordan was at the precinct submitting her report. She spoke calmly to the officer receiving her documentation, explaining the timeline, the evidence, and the impact of the false emergency call. She didn't embellish or dramatize. She didn't need to. The facts were damning enough. The officer reviewed the phone records, then glanced at the accompanying photos, timestamps, and eyewitness accounts. It took only one look for him to understand the gravity of the case. False emergency reports weren't minor offenses. They were crimes that endangered lives. When Jordan left the precinct, she carried the calm certainty that the process was now in motion. She didn't know exactly how the aftermath would unfold, but she understood the momentum had shifted. The truth was no longer resting quietly in her binder. It was living in official channels now, and it would demand accountability. Back at Oak Ridge Reserve, neighbors gathered subtly in driveways and cul-de-sacs, exchanging theories in soft voices. Nobody openly celebrated the downfall of the HOA president, but many expressed quiet relief. For years, Linda's obsessive enforcement, petty violations, and suffocating presence had exhausted the community. Her unraveling felt less like scandal and more like long-delayed justice gently rippling across manicured lawns. Just after noon, the HOA board concluded its emergency meeting. The members exited the clubhouse looking pale and exhausted, carrying folders clutched to their chests. Whispered conversations followed. A few shook their heads. One muttered something about liability. Another mentioned community safety. Word spread fast that the board had voted to suspend Linda pending a formal hearing. When Linda heard the decision, she didn't react with the subdued professionalism she expected of others. Instead, she erupted. She marched back toward her home with panicked steps, her clipboard forgotten in the clubhouse. She slammed her door so hard the sound echoed through the cul-de-sac. Residents nearby exchanged startled glances before retreating quickly indoors. Inside her house, Linda collapsed on her couch in shock. She felt the world closing in, the consequences tightening around her like an invisible vice. She had believed, truly believed, that her authority insulated her from accountability. Now, that illusion lay shattered at her feet. Across the street, Jordan observed the scene through her window with measured calm. She didn't revel in the chaos. She didn't feel triumphant. She simply recognized that a long-delayed shift had begun. A system that had been abused was finally correcting itself. As evening approached, the neighborhood remained hushed, waiting for the next piece of news. Jordan sat at her desk, reviewing her remaining notes, ready for whatever came next. And across the street, Linda stared blankly at her wall, knowing that everything she had built her identity around, power, control, reputation, was slipping through her fingers.
Morning arrived with a muted stillness, the kind that settles over a place right before everything changes. Oak Ridge Reserve opened its eyes slowly, as if the entire neighborhood sensed the final chapter of an unraveling was about to unfold. Birds chirped along rooftop gutters, sprinklers switched on in synchronized arcs of water, and the sun cast soft beams across driveways that had seen more tension in the last week than in years. Inside her home, Jordan prepared for what she expected to be the final step of the ordeal. She reviewed her notes one last time, though she didn't need to. The details were engraved into her mind, the timeline, the evidence, the call logs, the witnesses. She wasn't driven by vindication or personal triumph. She was driven by duty, by the knowledge that someone had abused a system she had dedicated her life to serving. That kind of offense could not go unanswered. She gathered her binder, secured it in a protective case, and checked her messages. One stood out, a meeting scheduled for midday with a district-level investigator. Exactly the step she expected. Once a false emergency report escalated to this level, it became more than a community conflict. It became a matter for the justice system. Across the street, the Pennington house radiated turmoil. Curtains were drawn tightly shut. Porch lights flickered inconsistently, as though someone had been pacing all night. Inside, Linda sat rigidly on her sofa, staring at the wall with an expression numb from exhaustion. She had barely slept. Thoughts of consequences twisted through her mind in spirals. Criminal charges, civil liability, community disgrace, loss of authority. It was everything she feared rolled into one crushing wave. Her clipboard lay abandoned in a corner, forgotten in the chaos of her unraveling. The symbols of power she had once clung to, HOA badges, binders of regulations, stacks of notices, now felt like mocking reminders of the identity she had built on control rather than community. By 10 a.m., word spread that law enforcement had visited the clubhouse requesting access to HOA documentation. Residents exchanged glances from driveways, cautiously approached one another during brief moments of courage, and whispered updates like messengers passing along fragments of the truth. One resident mentioned seeing a police vehicle approach the Pennington residence earlier. Another claimed a board member admitted the HOA had been contacted for official cooperation. The news rippled through Oak Ridge Reserve with a mixture of dread and relief. The neighborhood had changed forever. Around noon, Jordan met with the district investigator at the precinct, presenting her file with calm clarity. She outlined the events, the danger posed by the false report, and the evidence that tied everything directly to Linda. The investigator listened without interruption, noting each point with the seriousness it deserved. False reports weren't simply nuisances. They undermined the very system meant to protect people. When used maliciously, they weren't just lies. They were weaponized fear. By the end of the meeting, the investigator confirmed the next steps. The case would proceed formally. Interviews would be conducted. Charges would be considered. Jordan thanked him and left, knowing the process was no longer in her hands. Justice had its own rhythm now, and she trusted it. When she returned home, the neighborhood seemed oddly quiet. Cars were parked neatly along curbs. Lawns were immaculate. But behind the perfect facades, an invisible weight pressed down. Anticipation, perhaps. Even a collective holding of breath. Then, in the late afternoon, it happened. 2 law enforcement vehicles turned onto Oak Ridge Lane. Their engines hummed softly as they rolled to a stop in front of the Pennington home. Doors clicked open. Officers stepped out with the composed seriousness of people carrying out unavoidable duties. Several residents peeked from deck railings and behind curtains, the entire neighborhood holding itself still. Oak Ridge Reserve, a place once obsessed with aesthetics and quiet conformity, now stood frozen as the truth finally arrived at Linda's doorstep. Inside, Linda watched the officers approach with a dawning realization. Her world, built on rules, control, and the illusion of authority, had collapsed entirely. She had always believed she was untouchable, that her position insulated her from consequences. Now, as she opened the door with trembling hands, reality swept over her like a cold tide. The conversation was brief and quiet, conducted with professionalism. There was no dramatic shouting, no spectacle, only the calm, steady process of accountability unfolding exactly as it should. Within minutes, she stepped onto her porch, escorted gently but firmly toward the waiting vehicle. Neighbors watched without celebration, their expressions sober. This wasn't entertainment, it was justice. And in that moment, Oak Ridge Reserve collectively understood the weight of what had taken place. A false report could have cost someone their life. A lie had endangered an entire emergency response team. This wasn't HOA drama anymore. It was a crime. As the vehicles drove away, the tension that had wrapped around the neighborhood began to release, slowly, subtly, like a trapped breath finally exhaled. Jordan watched from her window, not with satisfaction, but with closure. The process had unfolded as it should, driven by facts rather than emotion. She didn't revel in the sight. She simply nodded once, accepting that the community could now begin healing. Over the next days, the HOA board announced an emergency election to fill the vacant presidency. The tone of the community shifted noticeably, friendlier, calmer, more collaborative. Neighbors approached one another in ways they hadn't before. Some apologized quietly for ever giving Linda too much influence. Others thanked Jordan for handling